Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Life Sciences Communication Colloquium for this week. As you may have noticed, I'm not Dietram Scheufele, our usual host. I'm Mike Zenos. I'm a professor in the department, and I'll be standing in to host this week's colloquium while Dietram is away, which means it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker this week is Dr. Percival Matthews. He is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology right here at UW-Madison. And he does research on the learning of numeracy and math among people of all ages. And he's prepared to talk for us today on the importance of communication. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthews.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. And so let me make sure I get my screen sharing right. And so today, I just call this Everyday Academics, unleashing the power of research through effective communication. And I'll say on the front end that I am not a comms guy, which hopefully will mean that this is accessible or will appeal to those of you who also aren't trained in that particular way. If I were to tell you there we go. So when I say that I'm not a comms person by training, I'm still learning that you don't necessarily have to be, because there's a lot of help out there. And one of the things that I'll talk to you about is this, something's wrong with my focus. One of the things that I'll tell you about is this Everyday Academics program that I've tried to help launch, and another one where we're thinking a lot more about knowledge mobilization, about taking the sorts of things that we come up with in the university and distilling them and trying to work on some sort of knowledge push from our end, and also cultivating a pull from the side, from our practitioner side. Part of what got me thinking about this was this Wisconsin idea, this idea that the things that we produce are supposed to help enrich the lives of the people in the state. Yet we have the situation where when I write a paper, who reads it? Other PhDs. And if you go 2 floors down, somebody else with a PhD often still can't read the papers that we write for journals. So it was thinking a lot about how to make things accessible and how to make sure there's an audience for it. And when I say really, I'm not a comms person, like I'm not. So let me start off with a little bit about what I actually do. I ask questions like, hey, how do these evolutionarily ancient brains come to understand numbers and number symbols, these things that are new on an evolutionary time scale? And people have problems with things like fractions. Some kids will say 1/8 is bigger than 1/4 because 8 is bigger than 4. And one of the ways that I look at it is to say, well, what kinds of things do we have already? What sorts of things do we come equipped with in these ancient brains that can be sort of adapted, exapted to do this mathematical thing? And lots of times we teach fractions, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, we break something up, and then we count one of those 4. So you're doing this weird thing where you're counting to get to a number that you can't count to. And so one of my questions is, well, can perception help us with this? Can perception give us access to numerical magnitudes? Can perception give us access to fractions of all things? And a lot of people will say no, but then I ask people, hey, well, what's the difference between these 2 bottles? Can anybody see the difference between these bottles? Whoa, this thing's. So it's a camera trick, right? One of the bottles is much smaller than the other. You just brought it closer to the camera, but they look the same because that aspect ratio is the same. And you do this all the time. Like, these things are smaller or larger in your retina, depending on how far away from you are, but you still are able to see that this thing is the same, partially because you do track things like aspect ratios. And so I won't go into a lot of the psychophysics behind it, but I started wondering, to what extent can people sort of really judge the size of these perceptual ratios, and how abstract is it, and can they do it across different formats? And then trying to take that back to some sort of education thing. Can we use visual spatial sort of analogies so that if this non-symbolic thing like this circle ratio actually gives you an analog signal for how big a number is, to sort of inform what's going on with our symbolic numbers? So that's what I do, which is not a comms thing. But what I found out, there were a couple of accidental insights, right? Accidental insight number 1, a lot of people around you are comms people, even if they don't know it yet. So this guy is Jonathan Way. I met Jonathan Way on a basketball court in 2005 when I first started up graduate school at Vanderbilt. As it wound up, Jonathan was in my department. Now, Jonathan was doing some really, he's one of the people, when you see people talk about spatial ability, especially either spatial ability in math or the need to really track spatial ability, because a lot of people who will be good at science, they might not score quite as high on quant as some of the people who are scoring on spatial ability, and we need to track that because the people on the high end are wind up being really good scientists. So Jonathan Way's behind a lot of the psych behind that. And when Jonathan Way graduated, he got married, and his wife was going to medical school, and he left academia for a while, and before you know it, he was working for Psychology Today. So Jonathan Way calls me up out of the blue. He had seen some of the stuff I was working on. He's like, "Hey, let's do this piece profiling your work for Psychology Today." And what I did was I started looking back at other people I knew from graduate school, friendships that I let go, and a decent number of people were doing things that weren't necessarily the same science they set out to do, but they were still really into science. So they're working for things like Psychology Today or The Conversation. So that was accidental insight number one. Accidental insight number two is that there's more thirst for this work than I realized. So after this piece came out, I got this phone call from this guy. Now, who is this guy? I had no idea who he was. It's Tony McCraffy. He calls me up. It's a teacher. He's like, "Hey, I was reading about your work and I looked at the psych science article. I'm like, why are you reading psych science?" So he was a guy who had gone to school, gotten a PhD in psychology, and he had become a high school teacher. And then he wanted to write something for practitioners. And so a practitioner piece came out of that because there were people paying attention. And then as far as other people around, this guy. Who is this guy? This is the guy whose office was next door to me. We hired him to do certain communications things, workaday things for our office. But this is Steve Potter. He's a reporter. He knows all sorts of other reporters, and he's really interested in reporting on science work. He just doesn't always have people who he knows where to go get the stories from. And you find a lot of people like Steve in the universities. It's interesting. One of the terrible things that's happened over the last, couple decades is what's happened to print journalists. And a lot of them go off and do other things because they can't make a full-time living as print journalists anymore. But a lot of them are still journalists at heart and like to do this kind of work. I guess one more thing that I should have put on, but I completely forgot about until just now. There's a comedian. What's the comedian's name? He did some things on Comedy Central, and he has these shows. Like he did one. He invited me to one downtown at the comedy club downtown. And what he does is he does a comedy show that it puts science talks in the middle, like real science talks. So he'll do a comedy monologue, and then you'll give your science talk. And then there's another monologue and somebody else gives a science talk. So I learned a lot about a new Australopithecine that I didn't know about. And then you talk to the crowd all together. And it was a packed house. And so this was really interesting to me, these things that I learned by accident as far as what kinds of appetite there are for these sorts of things. So the accidents helped. And on top of that, there were a couple little pushes. You come in and you start doing your work, and it's easy to focus just on the science that you're doing. But we got a couple pushes. One was grand challenges from the School of Education, where what they really wanted to do was spark interdisciplinary teams to engage in projects to make a profound difference in the world. Research 4 recently had one. What they wanted to do was support these collaborative projects that have the potential to fundamentally transform a field of study. And as I thought about these things, I came back to this Wisconsin idea. I came back to the idea that we spend so much time doing so much good work, but there's this gap between that work and the public consumption appreciation of it. And part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of us aren't trained to interact with the public or to really see what kind of pull there is from the public. So one of the things that I did for this grand challenges was called Everyday Academics. And what we wanted to do is to build this bridge between the university and the community by sort of opening the university's research world more to people. And we were thinking in this framework in terms of this producer push, as far as making sure that the researchers at the university, and we were a school of education based, were thinking about producing things that were intended for public consumption, right? From inception, right? So they're going to be things that you push out to your academic outlets, but they're things that are intended to be shared with the public. We wanted to look at user pull, these non-academic efforts to seek information. And as I started contacting lots of different community organizations, whether it was a school principal, whether it was somebody at the United Way, whether it was somebody at Department of Public Education, I found that lots of people were interested in this, sort of us getting a grasp of what people in the community wanted to know, and also making things that were distilling what we know, and then thinking about different types of co-production or ways that we have these sort of joint efforts. And so what we had here was this idea, how could we build this network, a basic framework, but then the team. So I'm not a comms guy. I'm not a comms guy, but you look around this university and so many people are. So Steve Potter was there. Mike Wagner from Journalism and Mass Communication has all the comms expertise in the world. And then I found Thulani Davis. Who is Thulani Davis? Thulani Davis is a really well-known journalist. She's won a Grammy before for some liner notes she wrote. She helped find, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I asked her when I first met her, I looked at her CV, I'm like, oh my God, you're a brand new assistant professor. Why are you an assistant professor? And she says, after they cut me from the third news organization. And again, this is really something that's happening. It's a terrible thing that's happening to journalism more generally. But what it does mean is that there's more talent and more people around who, if you're interested in building some of these things, really are oriented towards communication. And, I want to underscore, well, I'll show you one more quick thing. So what I found is this demand is there. So just in a couple of days when I was emailing around and calling people around to see who wanted to participate in this everyday academics, where we look at these academic topics from an educational point of view, we sort of call from the community for ideas of things that they want distilled down, and then researchers who were like, yeah, I'd like to do that. And I'd like to work with some reporters and people who do journalism or are used to writing for the public to help distill these things to answer those questions. There were lots of people throughout the university, some professors, lots of graduate students. I pulled out here just a few of the community organizations that were interested, WRSA, this Wisconsin Rural Schools Alliance, Latino Educational Council, Reach Dane, the Wisconsin Educational Council. We got a letter from the Madison Metro School District Superintendent, the Scholars Strategy Network. We have a letter from the editor-in-chief of Discover Magazine. Again, these are people, Discover Magazine, they want stories, the conversation, they want stories. And these are the sorts of things where that demand is there. And sometimes when you're on the bench, or you're crunching things in Stata or R or whatever, it can get sort of distant from us. But if we work to look for them, sometimes these people are there. So this did not win the competition for our grand challenges, but it's still around, right? So there are these outgrowths, because when we did reach out to people to show what we wanted to do, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, there were some people who were interested in funding at least part of the project. And one of the things that we have right now, I've put a link up. I can put a link in the chat a little bit later. It's this little flip grid. And so with these flip grids, what we do is we're looking at different researchers across the School of Education and asking for them to share short videos about 3 things from their research that they would want the public to know. We now have an Everyday Academics newsletter. We've been sending it out to all the principals throughout the state and get an open rate of somewhere around 25%. And we have a couple op-eds that are coming up with people who are doing more engaged source of work. So we're still trying to make it grow. And again, even though we didn't get the big funding up front, that audience really is there. And, the ideas continue to evolve. So, actually, I should pause for just a second. I'm talking faster than I realized. Did anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so what I want to talk about now is how this idea has been evolving and just what's happened as it's evolved. So when Research Forward asked, what do you want to do that could transform an area of research? I do math education. I do mathematical cognition. And I started thinking about what we really needed. And I thought if I were going to try to transform math education, I would do something like this. We have all of this research that is communicated, that was produced at the university level, but so much of it is either behind a paywall or inaccessible to people. And what I wanted to do is to have something that both used our writers like Steve to help university researchers make things more accessible, but also that from the very beginning started to create relationships between our researchers and our communities. So what we want to do is to start a practitioner network, an online network that engages math educators in sort of like consuming different types of math educational research. And at the same time that we're starting those sorts of conversations to help promote teacher sort of action research, where they generate their own research questions, where we help with that. And then we'll have more of a writing hub where we're producing public facing research products. So if we look at the components of this, we wanted to create this active statewide social network of math education practitioners that will be dedicated to reviewing, implementing, creating research. And then we wanted to encourage and aid them in developing, executing plans for carrying out teacher-led action research. We want to engage them from the beginning, at the very least, so that they can see sort of transparently some of the things that we're doing in one of our big, rigorous university-led research projects. And then create a hub that's dedicated to creating these accessible public-facing research projects in multiple formats. So if we look at it again, what we have is this idea, a basic framework, that starts with knowledge mobilization basics, that is communications forward from conception, that on some level is modular, because what that will allow is me to have a big team, but where people have enough autonomy that they push a lot of the projects that they want to push, but so that it still fits together. It's conceptually modular, but it fits together more seamlessly and more organically. And then want it to start to get early stakeholder engagement. And again, if you look at two of these things, I think they're really important. So this communications forward from conception is something that is going to be important to, well, basically any of you who are writing grants. So I've sat on grant panels for IES, Institute of Education Sciences. I've sat on grant panels for NSF. I've sat on grant panels for NIH. And when it comes down to dissemination plans, all these organizations are getting to be more and more serious about it. And one of the things that can really differentiate one grant from the next is the extent to which their dissemination is, yeah, we'll write some papers, yes, we'll go to some conferences, versus something that's been thought out, versus something that is really communications forward and shows that you have the connections and the expertise, so that you very at least thought about how to communicate this. Do you go to places where the most interested stakeholders will actually go? So the third part that you saw before is this team. And so what I wanted to do this time is I wanted to build a team. And when I say it's communications forward, we've got these different expertise. So Dietram's actually part of this team, as is Mike Wagner, as is Steve Potter. And then there's this link where Annalie Good actually does quite a lot. She helps run the Wisconsin Scholar Strategy Network, but she also does just lots of work with practitioners in education with the Department of Public Instruction. And here we've got people who work with teachers, actual educational practitioners. These are both math education professors. And then people who do the psychology, so that what you're building is a bridge from the science that is thinking about the communications, that is already stopped and also recruited. I think I'm missing a slide. Oh, different, also going out and surveying and seeing who in the field of stakeholders is actually interested. So we have letters from the Wisconsin-Minnesota Comprehensive Center Network, from the UW Place, which does a lot of peer learning for educators, again, the MMSD superintendent in the Department of Public Instruction. And I every once in a while, when I'm feeling really, sort of grandiose and, tomorrow Pinky the world, you just think about this demand really is there. and there are a lot of people here who have the expertise to help you communicate better. What you need to do is to have the will, a little plan, and make some friends, and a lot of people can help make that happen. And so I'm no expert, but I'm slowly making progress. And if I go back, also, if any of you have anything that you want to do as far as a public Flipgrid for things that you would like in terms of public education that you would like people to know, and there's whether that's public health or whatever sorts of other things, we have space for you too, and I can get in contact with you. But with that, I am going to wrap up and stop for your questions.